The frost crackled under his boots, a sound like tiny bones breaking with every step. It was the only sound, really, out here where the world had been scoured clean and left for dead. The wind was a low, constant moan through the empty stable, a sound that had started to feel like the only thing left in his chest. It carried the smell of old hay and deep, penetrating cold, a scent that had settled into his wool coat, his hair, the back of his throat. It was the smell of absence. What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a silence where their voice used to be? When the space they occupied in the world remains, a perfect, aching outline of them, but all that's left to fill it is this hollow, screaming quiet. He came here every day, not because he wanted to, because he didn't know where else to go. The house was too full of her things, her ghost sitting in her favorite chair, her scent still clinging to a sweater she'd left on the hook by the door. Out here, the grief was simpler. It was just cold. It was just the work of breaking the ice on the water trough, the mechanical scrape of the shovel clearing a path that would only be buried again by morning. And then there was the horse. It stood, in the far corner of the paddock, a statue carved from the same gray stone as the sky. It wasn't hers, not really. It had been a project, a hopeful, foolish thing she'd brought home last spring. A skinny Icelandic foal with a mane like tangled flax and eyes too wise for its young face. She'd named it Vaughn, she said. Hope. She'd laughed, a sound that used to light up the whole valley and said every farm needed a little hope. He'd just smiled and shook his head, watching her lead the skittish creature into the stable he'd spent a month rebuilding. Now, Vaughn was all that was left of that laugh. The horse didn't do much. It stood. It breathed plumes of vapor into the frigid air. It watched him. That was the worst of it, the watching. Its eyes were dark, liquid pools that seemed to see straight through the thick layers of his coat and his solitude, right down to the raw, splintered thing he'd become. It wasn't a judgment. It was worse. It was a quiet, patient witnessing. He kept his distance. He did the chores. He tossed fresh hay into the rack, the golden strands a violent shock of color against the monochrome world. Vaughn would wait until he'd stepped back, until the gate latch had clicked shut before moving toward it. There was no trust there. Only a shared understanding of survival, a transactional peace. You stay over there. I'll stay over here. We will both continue to exist in this frozen hell. One afternoon, the wind died completely. The silence it left behind was somehow louder, more oppressive. He was mending a section of fence, his gloves off, his fingers stiff and clumsy with the cold, fumbling a nail. He dropped it into the deep snow with a soft thump of frustration. He muttered a curse, a short, sharp word that hung in the still air like a stain, and from across the paddock, Vaughn's head lifted. A sharp, sudden movement. The ears pricked forward, swiveling toward the sound of his voice. It was the most animated he'd ever seen the animal. He froze, holding his breath. The horse took a single step forward, then another. Its nostrils flared, sampling the air between them, searching for something. It wasn't approaching him. It was approaching the ghost of that sound. He didn't move. He became part of the fence, post, part of the cold. His heart was a frantic, trapped bird beating against his ribs. Vaughn took a few more steps, hesitant, each hoof placed with deliberate care in the snow. It stopped about 10 feet away, close enough that he could see the individual whiskers around its muzzle, the long, dark lashes framing its eyes. It just stood there, looking at the space where the sound had come from. Looking at him, minutes passed. The cold began to seep through his sleeves, biting at his skin. He slowly, so slowly it felt like the movement of continents, bent his knees and reached into the snow. His numb fingers closed around the cold metal of the nail. As he straightened up, his joints protesting, he let out a slow, careful breath. The horse's ears twitched. Its head cocked just a fraction. It was listening. To him. To the simple, human sound of his breathing. He didn't know what to do. The space between them felt charged, fragile, a thin sheet of ice over black water. One wrong move, and it would all shatter. He could turn away. Go back to the house. Preserve the awful familiar distance. It was the safe thing. The easy thing. Instead, he did nothing. He just stood, and he waited. Vaughn lowered its head. It took one more step, then another, closing the distance until he could feel the warmth of its breath, see the pulse beating in its neck. It stretched, its neck out, its muzzle moving cautiously through the air. It wasn't looking for food. It was investigating. The worn wool of his sleeve, the frozen denim of his jeans. Its breath was warm and sweet with the scent of hay, a shocking living warmth in the dead air. He held his hand out, palm down, fingers relaxed. An offering, and question. The velvet softness of the horse's muzzle touched his knuckles. It was the lightest possible touch, a whisper against his frozen skin. It sniffed, its breath huffing warm across his wrist. And then, it did something he did not expect. It pressed its broad, solid forehead against his open palm. Just for a second, a weight, a warmth, an acknowledgement. Then it turned, its hooves crunching in the snow, and walked back to its corner, leaving him standing there, his hand still outstretched, the imprint of its warmth already fading in the cold. He finished the fence on autopilot, his mind elsewhere. The chores were done. There was no reason to stay. He gathered his tools, his movements slow, waited. He latched the gate behind him, the click echoing in the quiet yard. He took a dozen steps toward the house, toward the silence that waited. For him there. He stopped. He didn't mean to. His body just refused to take another step. He turned around, and there, at the fence line, stood Vaughn. Not eating, not looking away. Just standing, watching him leave. Its ears were forward, its posture, still, it was waiting. For what? He didn't know. He didn't know why it had touched him. He didn't know why it was watching him now. He didn't know anything at all, except that the hollow quiet inside him felt, for the first time in months, a little less empty. She didn't know why the horse had followed her voice out of the silence, or why, when she finally turned to walk back to a house that was no longer a home, it was the sound of the horse's quiet breath behind her that made her own breath catch in her throat. The quiet that followed was different. It wasn't the hollow, screaming silence of before. It was a quiet that had breath in it. It had weight. The space between them, the 10 feet of trampled snow, was no longer a chasm. It was a bridge, fragile and newly built, and every day he crossed it with a heart that felt both heavier and lighter than it had any right to be. He still came at the same time. The frost still cracked under his boots. The wind still moaned. But now, Vaughn would lift its head at the first sound of the gate. The ears would pivot, tracking his movement, no longer with wary suspicion, but with a quiet, steady recognition. The horse began to meet him at the fence line, not all the way, but halfway, waiting for the hay, for the fresh water, for the slow, deliberate scratch he'd started giving it right between the eyes, where the forelock was thickest and softest. It was in these moments, his bare hand against the warmth of its coat, that he noticed the small things. The way Vaughn would sometimes freeze, its whole body going still as a rock, its head tilted as if listening to a frequency only it could hear. Or how its gaze would sometimes drift past him, toward the low stone wall that separated the paddock from the wild, untamed land beyond, and a low, almost imperceptible shudder would run the length of its spine. It wasn't fear exactly. It was a deep, cellular remembering. He found himself talking. It started as a mumble, instructions to himself about the chores. Then it became observations about the weather, the stubbornness of a particular ewe, the price of feed, meaningless things, just noise to fill the space. But Vaughn listened. Its ears would swivel and flick, and it would sometimes blow a soft, puffing breath through its nostrils, a punctuation mark in his one-sided conversation. One afternoon he was talking about the roof of the stable, how the wind had ripped a shingle loose. "I'll have to get up there before the next storm," he muttered, more to himself than to the horse. Elin always said I'd put it off, until the snow was falling on my head. The name. He hadn't said her name out loud in months. It fell into the space between them like a stone. Vaughn's head snapped up. The horse didn't startle. It went absolutely rigid. Its eyes, usually so soft and liquid, widened, showing a thin crescent of white around the edges. It took a single, abrupt step backward, its hooves scraping on the frozen ground. It wasn't a reaction to a sudden noise. It was a reaction to that noise, to that specific collection of sounds, his own breath caught in his throat. "What?" he whispered. "What is it?" The horse just stared at him, its chest heaving, its entire being focused on him with an intensity that was almost frightening. It was as if it were seeing right through him, looking for the source of the voice that had spoken the name. A cold dread, entirely separate from the winter air, began to creep up his spine. He spent the next few days testing the theory, a morbid, painful curiosity driving him. He'd weave other names into his ramblings, the neighbors, the vets, his own. Nothing. Vaughn would maybe flick an ear, continue chewing its hay, entirely uninterested. But if he said, "Elin," if he even whispered it under his breath, the effect was immediate and profound. The horse would stop dead. Its head would come up. Its entire attention would laser in on him, a mixture of confusion, anticipation, and a deep, aching longing etched into every line of its body. It was waiting for her. It was listening for her footsteps, for her laugh, for her to come around the corner and make everything right again. He was the same. The horse was just a mirror with 4 legs and a beating heart. The realization broke something open inside him. This animal wasn't just a project she'd left behind. It was a living, breathing archive of her. It knew the cadence of her voice. It remembered the specific scent of her shampoo on her skin when she leaned her forehead against its neck. It carried the memory of her hands, the shape of her touch. All this time, he had thought he was alone in his grief. But he had been sharing this paddock, this silence, with the only other being on earth who missed her exactly as much as he did. The dam held for a week. He held it together through sheer force of will, through the numbing repetition of chores, but the truth was a pressure building behind his eyes, in his throat, in the tight ball of his fists. The breaking point was a glove. He was cleaning out the last stall, the one she had used for storage, shoving aside old sacks and broken tools to make more room for hay. His hand brushed against something soft, buried under a folded tarp. He pulled it out. It was one of her work gloves, the left one. It was worn thin at the fingertips, stained with dirt, and what looked like a splash of green paint from the day. They'd painted the kitchen. He could still see the faint impression of her hand in the leather. He brought it to his face without thinking. The smell was faint, almost gone, buried under dust and time. But it was there. Underneath it all, like a ghost note, was the essential scent of her. Jasmine and soil and sunshine. It was too much. The careful wall he'd built around himself crumbled into dust. He sank to his knees right there in the filthy straw, the glove clutched in his hand. A sound tore out of him, a raw, ragged thing that was half sob, half scream. He didn't try to stop it. He couldn't. The grief came in waves, shaking his entire body, hot tears freezing on his cheeks the moment they fell. He was alone. He was so utterly, completely alone. She was gone, and all that was left was a worn-out glove and a world that had turned to ice. He didn't know how long he knelt there, lost in the storm, but gradually, through the roaring in his ears, he became aware of a new sound, a soft rhythmic blowing, a warmth on the top of his head. He looked up, his vision blurred. Vaughn was there. The horse had left its hay, had walked into the stable, and was now standing over him. It hadn't nudged him. It hadn't whinnied. It was just there. Its head was lowered, its nostrils flared, breathing in the scent of his grief, breathing out warm, steady puffs of air that misted in the cold. Stable. It stood so close he could feel the solid, immense heat of its body. A shelter. A bulwark. It lowered its head further until its broad, flat forehead rested gently against his heaving chest. The weight of it was immense, grounding. It was not a demand. It was an anchor. It was saying, "I am here, I am here. This storm, I know it. We will wait it out together." He wrapped his arms around the horse's great, sturdy neck, buried his face in its coarse mane, and wept until there was nothing left. And Vaughn never moved. It just stood, its breath slowing to match his, its immense heart beating a steady, patient rhythm against his own. A silent vigil for a woman they had both loved, keeping watch over the pieces of him she had left behind. Weeks later, the deep freeze began to loosen its grip. Patches of brown earth showed through the snow like secrets being revealed. The wind lost its knife's edge, carrying instead the wet, fertile smell of thawing ground. He was mending a different section of fence, the work easier now without the biting cold. Vaughn was grazing nearby on the first tender shoots of grass, its winter coat beginning to shed in great, fuzzy clumps. Their rhythm was easy, familiar. The silence between them was no longer something to be endured, but something to be shared. As he hammered a nail home, Vaughn's head came up. It wasn't the startled rigidity of before. It was a calm, curious lifting. It sniffed the air, then took a few steps away from the fence, toward a large, snow-covered mound of old hay and discarded brush at the edge of the property. It was a place they both ignored, a forgotten midden heap from a busier time. Vaughn stopped, at the edge of the mound, and began to nudge at something with its nose, not eating, just pushing. It looked back at him, then back to the pile, and gave a soft, insistent nicker. "What have you found, boy?" he asked, dropping the hammer and walking over. He pushed aside the brittle, frozen branches. Underneath, half-rotted and bleached, by the elements, was an old wooden sign. He had to pull it free. It was heavy. He turned it over. She had painted it herself. The letters were wobbly, filled with a joyful, amateur enthusiasm. Green paint, the same green that was on the glove. It spelled out 2 words, Vaughn plus, Elena plus sign. Not an ampersand, a plus sign. Because, she had told him, laughing as she painted, hope isn't something you just have. It's something you add. Every single day, you have to add it. He had forgotten. In the crushing weight of his loss, he had forgotten her most fundamental truth. He hadn't been left with nothing. He had been left with the one thing she believed in most. He had been left with the task of adding it, day by day. He looked from the sign to the horse, now calmly cropping grass as if it hadn't just unearthed the final piece of a shattered heart. It hadn't led him to a memory of her. It had led him back to her, to the way she saw the world. He ran his hand over the faded letters, the green paint still vibrant in the grooves of the wood. He wasn't okay. He knew that. The outline of her in the world would always be there. But the silence inside him wasn't hollow anymore. It was being filled slowly, by the crunch of snow underfoot, the sound of steady chewing, the warm huff of breath on a cold morning. It was filled with the quiet, steadfast work of adding hope. Sometimes the ones who carry you through the longest winter are the ones who were waiting for you in the snow all along. If this story found a place in your heart, then you know these moments of connection are what make us human. Subscribe and hit the bell icon to join our community. We bring you a new story every day, a new journey into the raw and beautiful truths that connect us all. Press follow, leave a comment with your thoughts, and be here for the next story that just might change everything.